Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. My name is Ray Perman, and I'm director of the David Hume Institute, and welcome to this evening's seminar. We've been rather obsessed by politics so far this year with our various seminars, but tonight we get back to real life and particularly to education. And a particular issue in education, which is the underachievement of boys as compared to girls in practically all stages of education from preschool up to first degree. Not particularly a Scottish problem, prevalent in the UK. Certainly it's an issue in Ireland and in several other countries too. And when we became interested in that subject, we found that there'd been very little research on it, even though it was a widespread problem. One of the few people that has done some research on this is our speaker this evening, Emer Smyth, who is a professor at the Economic and Social Research Institute in Dublin and heads the social research department in that institution. And Emer published a paper some years ago on this issue and agreed to come and speak this evening. We're very grateful to Linda Croxford and to Cathy Howison, both of the University of Edinburgh, who have produced some new figures to help Emer to update and particularly focus on the Scottish area of the problem. So without further ado, I'm going to call on Emer Smyth. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ray, for the kind invitation, and thank you all for being here this evening. What I'm going to do this evening is talk a little bit about the background to this issue. I give you a flavour of really comprehensive analysis carried out by Linda Croxford and Cathy Howison to show you what the situation is in Scotland, and they're sitting down the back. They're going to take the difficult questions on Scotland. I'm going to talk about some potential explanations for gender differences in educational outcomes, including whether it's nature or nurture, whether it reflects broader social change, what role the educational system plays, what role the school plays. And I'm going to talk a little bit about out-of-school learning. But then I want to kind of, towards the end, nuance it a little and say, really, are we talking about girls and boys, or are we talking about some girls and some boys having difficulties? I'm going to round out by saying a little bit about policy and practice, and hopefully we can pick that up in the discussion, because I want to leave a good chunk of time for discussion at the end, and we can tease out those issues a little bit more. So the background is really that, certainly even over my career, my reading career of this literature, is we've seen a shift from a focus in the 1970s and 80s with the early feminist scholars on female disadvantage towards a concern with male underachievement. And as Ray pointed out, we've seen a reversal in the gender gap in educational attainment in recent decades in most Western countries, though the scale differs across countries and the timing of that shift also differs. At any given educational level, we also see that girls tend to do, on average, better in terms of exam results or grades achieved in coursework either. But at the same time, in spite of this progress, if you like, at educational level, we see that gender differences are quite resistant to change in terms of fields of study. We've seen the feminisation of some areas like medicine and law, but there are really persistent gender gaps in the STEM fields and also in craft areas, which are rarely talked about when we talk about gender differences. So I'm just going to give you, before that, I also think it's important to stress that there's a lot of debate about whether this is a real phenomenon, a worrying phenomenon, or if there's a bit of moral panic about it. Are we overstating the case? And I think Jessica Ringrose puts it very well. She said the failing boys discourse draws on specific measures of girls' superior educational achievements as compared to boys to support claims that girls have reached unparalleled levels of success, and feminist interventions into schooling have been met and may have gone too far, so that girls' achievements are continuously positioned as one at the expense of the boys. And when I talk about the implications for policy and practice, I'm going to revisit that idea about whether we should be talking about this kind of zero-sum trade-off between the education of girls and boys, or whether we should be looking for other solutions. Now, I'm really only giving you a flavour of the findings that Linda and Kathy produced, just to illustrate the story and to show what the state of gender in education is in Scotland, though there are much richer analyses there. So if we look at expected curriculum for excellence level in reading for the most recent figures for which data are available, and we see boys and girls compared at each level. So we can see over the primary years, we can see gender gap at P1, P4 and P7, and actually we see over that period the gender gap widens. And we can also see the gender gap is still evident when we get to lower secondary education. When we take an alternative metric, which is staying on rates in publicly funded schools, we also see a gender gap, though not as large, in staying on at S5, but it's slightly a larger gender gap than at S6. But we see, as in other countries, that there are gender differences in the types of knowledge to which young women and men are exposed. I've just given you a few samples, but you can see the kind of gender stereotyping is still there. So we see that the take-up of childcare courses and art and design courses at level 6 are predominantly female, but at the other end of the spectrum, computing science, engineering and physics are predominantly male. Among school leavers, girls are much more likely to go on to higher education than boys. So 42% of females do so compared to 32% of males. But again, we see persistent differences in field of study among those who do go on to higher education. So women are a small minority of those studying engineering and computer science, but the vast majority of those studying education. And young women and men are equally likely to go on to further education, but even though they're equally represented in that sector, what they study differs significantly. You see that those studying social care are almost entirely female, hairdressing almost the same, and girls making up only a tiny minority of those studying construction courses. But at the same time, we see, and this isn't something I'm going to get a chance to go into, when we look at labour market outcomes, we see in spite of those differences in going on to higher education, and in spite of the kind of higher grades achieved by girls, that actually graduate salaries are lower for women than men on average, if we look at UK figures as a whole. Now, that picture for Scotland is quite similar to the kind of picture you'd see for Ireland and to many other Western European countries and North American countries as well. So I want to kind of try and tease through some of the potential explanations that have been offered for this phenomenon. And first of all, for a long time people had talked about nature. They had stopped talking about biology as destiny, if you like, when it came to women and men. They'd stopped saying that boys are naturally hardwired to have better spatial abilities. But in fact, the growth in the attention and the growth in the development of neuroscientific explanations over the last decade and a half has shed new light on neuroscience as an explanation for gender differences in ability. So, you know, there are some studies that have maintained that the male brain and the female brain are quite different, that different neural networks light up when different tasks are engaged in, and so on. But these explanations have been very widely critiqued for a number of reasons. Firstly, they fail to recognise the complex interaction between genes, hormones and the environment. So the idea of the plasticity of the brain, of the neural networks, has come to the fore. So therefore, the kinds of activities that girls and boys engage in actually build particular networks. So therefore, reinforcing a particular, if you like, brain scan image. But yet, when people change their activities, their neural networks form and reform in response to that. Another issue that these explanations fail to account for is that, as we saw for Scotland, gender differences in test scores tend to be larger among older students. And so it's hard to explain how that could relate to kind of neural pathways and so on. And similarly, these differences don't explain differences over time or between countries, because it's been a long time since anyone has tried to argue that there are ethnic or temporal differences in brain structure. So then, is it nurture? I mean, obviously there's a large body of literature looking at the ways in which boys and girls are socialised into what are seen as appropriate gendered roles, and that this occurs from infancy. It's been well documented that the kind of interaction that adults and children have differs by child gender and by adult gender, and that children learn to categorise people by gender from a very early age, and their gender identity is formed relatively early. And even very young children are found to have highly stereotyped views of what occupations are appropriate for women and appropriate for men. So from this perspective, if we see people formed by the views of adults and the world around them, then one of the potential explanations, and one that I think has a good deal of merit, is that broader changes in women's political and labour force participation can create a new set of influences to form children's views of appropriate behaviour. So if young girls, for example, see role models out there, they see that women are active in politics, are active in employment, or entering professional occupations, then that provides a different suite of role models for them than previously. So a number of studies in Europe and in North America have said that the trends in the gender gap relate to growing employment opportunities for women. So in this way, that those growing employment opportunities increase the value of education. And they do that, they're seen to do this in two ways. First, they kind of, for the girls themselves, it's seen as providing more reason for them to stay on in education and to go on to higher education if there are professional jobs out there. And we have seen the growth of professional jobs in most Western countries over time, and a significant growth in public sector employment in many countries. But Dupreet and Bookman in particular would say it's not only that girls' perceived value on education changes in response to these broader social changes, but that their parents take a different view, that they start to see it as worthwhile to, quote unquote, invest in the education of their daughters relative to their sons. Now, that's a convincing explanation, and I've seen it documented very well in some contexts, but it doesn't always apply. I mean, it's interesting, if we look at countries like Ireland, we actually saw that female educational expansion happened before employment growth. And the employment growth was really triggered by the Celtic Tiger boom, but that the educational expansion happened before that. So it's not a simple explanation. Allied to this, on the male side then, a number of theorists would say that the decline of traditional craft and industrial jobs has meant that young working class boys in particular don't see themselves as having a secure future, an identifiable future in the local community, and that this contributes to school disengagement, so that this in a way devalues their investment in education. Now, there are a number of reasons for saying it's not all about society. It's not all about broader society. It's also about the education system in general. And I'm going to talk about two aspects of the educational system and then about schools themselves. So the two aspects I'm going to talk about are tracking and assessment. So, as you know, in many countries like Germany and Austria, there is tracking into very specific vocational tracks from very early on. For example, until very recently in Germany, at the age of 10, children were tracked into academic or vocational schools, and within the vocational schools into quite specific fields of study. And comparative research has shown that where those choices are made earlier, because we've seen that young children tend to have quite stereotyped views, they tend to be more gendered. So where those choices are made early on, and also where they're made in the absence of having much experience of a particular subject. So if people don't have exposure to a particular array of subjects, they're more likely to make gender stereotyped choices. So we actually see that if we look across countries, that gender segregation in the type of course taken and in the labour market is greater in highly tracked systems where students are separated into vocational tracks at an early age. Now, the second aspect, and one that's probably been a more live debate in the UK as a whole, in England in particular, has been the findings that there are girls and boys respond differently to different types of assessment, to different types of tests and different assessments. Now, the reasons for that could come from the socialisation that we talked about, could come from the kinds of activities they've been exposed to prior to that. But generally, it's found that girls tend to do better on more open-ended, more sustained tasks, while boys focus more on factual detail, more episodic answers. So boys, on average, tend to do better in multiple choice questions, while it's been found that girls do slightly better when the assessment is based on coursework. But also, even with the examination system, it's been argued that that kind of tends to favour the kind of writing skills, the narrative, the descriptive, the rich description that girls are generally good at because of kind of better reading scores, if you like. Now, some commentators have said that actually the change in assessment, that is the introduction of coursework as a basis for assessment in the GCSEs in England, that explains the reversal of the gender gap, full stop. And that's a very neat explanation if you just look at England, because you see quite a shift over that period of the phased introduction of those GCSE coursework and assessment. And that's been used as a reason for flipping back to exams, one of the reasons, but that's another debate. But actually, it's what a neat explanation is kind of overturned a little bit if you look at other countries. In Ireland, we still have a really strong exam focus. Our assessment at the end of lower secondary education, though there is some reform going, stalled at the moment, and at the end of upper secondary education are very much based on a terminal written examination. But we have seen the same shift in the gender patterns in performance that have been seen, with the shift to coursework. So it's not just assessment. There's obviously something else going on there. So is it schools? Is it what happens in the classroom, on the corridors of schools? There's been quite a lively debate about whether the gender gap is the same across different schools. And some studies have shown that it does vary significantly, that you can get much smaller gender gaps in achievement in some schools than in others. However, others have kind of argued that, okay, you see that variation, but you're not actually identifying any schools where boys are doing much better than their female counterparts. So where does that leave us in terms of achievement? I'm going to get back to that in a minute. There's a much more solid evidence base that schools matter for subject choice. There is a lot of work in Europe and North America which shows that schools that in other ways look very similar can differ in what subjects they choose to provide to students, even in the context of a national curriculum, and in how they make these subjects available to girls and boys. And even given what schools provide, where students have some choice over subjects, or where there are optional subjects, if you like, schools can frame that choice in a particular way by packaging subjects in a particular way. So, perhaps asking students to select between male and female subjects, but also through the informal and formal guidance that is given to students around what subjects they should be thinking about taking. Now, I'm going to give you an example of some research that we did in Ireland. I expect it would be pretty similar in Scotland and some other countries. And the focus of this was on the provision and take-up of technological subjects at lower secondary education. So things like metalwork and materials technology. We also looked at home economics as a female stereotyped subject. Now, we actually found that when you look across schools, what subjects schools choose to provide is influenced by their perceptions of the needs of the student population. Now, that sounds positive in that, school principals are saying that they're choosing the subjects that will match the needs of their students. But the difficulty is that that also runs the risk of reinforcing gender stereotypes and social stereotypes. So we found, there was much less provision of technological subjects in girls-only schools, excuse me, and much greater provision of, say, home economics in girls-only schools. So what it is assumed is appropriate for certain groups of students, girls and boys and different social groups, can actually limit the potential open to them. We also found that schools differed in the timing of subject choice. So in some cases, they allowed students to sample subjects before they chose them. And in that way, students had a better idea of what to expect. But in other cases, they asked students to pick their lower secondary subjects before they'd actually entered the school. So in that case, students were relying on perhaps more stereotyped notions of what the subjects were, more notions of what the subject had been like in their parents' day rather than what it may actually be like now. But we also found that how subjects are framed and constructed in day-to-day interaction in the school and classroom is very heavily influenced by gender. So that gender becomes bound up with the character of the subject. I'm just going to grab some water if that's okay. Quotes here from young people that we spoke to, and there was a real kind of perception of technological subjects as very dirty, hands-on, heavy work, even though they had actually moved over time to a much more design focus. So this group of girls said, when asked, about what subjects they'd chosen, why they hadn't thought about taking any of the technological subjects, they said because lads work with their hands more. We prefer more business, accounting or that. They probably want to be like engineers or something because that's more of a man's job. Girls are not interested in working with the machinery and everything. Girls would rather do something that they could use for the future, which actually points to the way in which notions of appropriate jobs feed back into the school. We don't want to get our hands dirty, break a nail or something. And you saw similar stereotypes when we spoke to boys about home economics. One group of male students said, sure, isn't it all about pregnancy and everything? Boys would be no good at that, I'd say. So the gender also plays out in the day-to-day interaction in the classroom. And it's very interesting, if you look back at some of the early feminist work in education, the accounts focused on the way in which classroom interaction was dominated by boys. But the argument was that domination was a contributory factor in girls being disadvantaged. So Del Spender's book from 82 was called Learning to Lose. And she wasn't talking about boys losing, she was talking about girls losing. So there's quite a large body of literature which says that, in a whole class situation, boys tend to dominate. They tend to contribute more to interaction. They'll call out answers, and they often get more feedback from teachers on their answers. They tend to also dominate in hands-on activities, so in group work, lab work, and in the playground. But all of that interaction isn't positive, because we also find that boys tend to be more disruptive, or at least seen as more disruptive in the class, and they experience more negative interaction as a result of this misbehaviour. And there's increasing work being done at the lower end of the age spectrum, looking at preschool and school entry children. And this work really points to a significant difference in social and behavioural skills between boys and girls at that early stage. And this has been argued that it's pretty foundational, so that girls are, if you like, and I don't like the phrase, more school ready. So therefore they become accustomed to the classroom more quickly, and they actually get positive feedback more often from teachers because they are kind of, if you like, positive, pro-social, and not acting out in the same way. But at the same time, okay, this is a nice explanation, but it doesn't explain how the interaction patterns have remained pretty unchanged over a significant period, at least the period we can document, when we've seen significant shifts in the gender gap in achievement. So there's a risk of explaining things on a really kind of post hoc basis. When it comes to teacher expectations, we also see that same pattern. So initially, it was felt that teachers held lower expectations for girls. And more recently, research has shown that teachers are more likely to identify male students, or particular male students specifically, as underachievers. But also that they view underachievement differently for girls and boys. So underachieving girls are seen as lacking in confidence, being afraid to speak up. But underachieving boys are seen as disaffected, poorly motivated, and acting up in class. So even the construction of what makes a bad student can be quite different for girls and boys. Now, probably the most prominent explanation offered for the shift in the gender pattern in achievement has been the ladishness. Okay. Certainly in England and English and Scottish research, this has been given the most attention. So basically the argument is that it's all about peer culture. The boys are trying to act out the process of being a boy by operationalising a male identity that is based on physical prowess and non-school activities like sports. It's been argued or found too that boys are reluctant to be seen to engage in schoolwork, to be seen to strive to do well, because they want to avoid being made fun of by their male peers, and potentially too because they're afraid of failing and losing face. It's argued that girls don't have that sort of peer network, that it's more acceptable among girls to do well in school, that they will not risk being ridiculed, ostracised and so on by doing well. Again, this is a really prominent explanation. If you stopped any average gender academic, that's probably the explanation they come out with. But I'm not sure it's the full story. I think it's a little bit of the story, and I'm not sure why the shift either. And I'm telling you this because I've had this discussion with people in Ireland, and they've said, oh, it's the ladishness about Irish students. But when we actually spoke to students over time about achievement, the boys who were disaffected didn't seem to mock others who engaged in schoolwork. But it was more a case of, well, good for him, but it's not what I'm interested in. And there didn't seem to be the same censure for trying to do well or trying to do homework or working hard that was there in some of the other studies. But I think that's open for debate. There's also been very little attention in this kind of research to the fact that girls are often paying a price for doing well. And our work and other work has documented a good deal of exam-related stress and anxiety among girls. I mean, in work we've done, we found that in the run-up to what's called the Leaving Certificate, which would be the equivalent of Hires, which is really high stakes in Ireland, and all focused on one set of examinations, that about 2/3 of the girls were losing sleep over worry, even 3 months, 4 months before their exams. But yet that isn't seen as kind of it being a trade-off for girls. So I would say the kind of image of a learner is a little bit more complex. And also, it's not clear that ladishness always manifests itself in the same way. I'm highlighting this study because it's a very interesting one that doesn't quite deliver what I felt it started out to. Basically, Lagawi and Dupreet did a study in Berlin schools, and they were looking at this whole notion of ladishness. And they found, which was very interesting, that boys were more responsive to the school culture than girls. So the boys varied more depending on the school they attended than girls did. And what they found is that schools can create a learning environment that promotes academic competition as an aspect of masculinity. So instead of masculinity being expressed as acting out, as disrupting, as rejecting school, they said there could be a positive aspect. There could be an expression as competition, if you like, an academic form of sport. Now, the bad news is that actually, when they measured this learning orientation, they measured it in terms of having more middle-class peers in the school. So they were saying that boys were more learning-oriented, more academically competitive when they were in with kind of higher ability, more middle-class peers. Now, what looked like it might be a nice little policy lever for affecting change and what we see as ladishness or masculinity in the classroom didn't actually work out so well and would require a good deal of social engineering to actually bring about change in that way. But I still think it's a potential for further study. What I've ended up kind of thinking myself is that it is really not just about ladishness, but a broader sense of the gendering of school engagement. I haven't actually been physically into a school in Scotland, so I'm making the assumption, but certainly in Ireland, secondary schools are still quite hierarchical in nature. Even though older students in particular are leading quite adult lives outside school, within schools they are still constructed as children or quasi-children in many ways. Maybe that's not true in Scotland. But in such systems, what actually happens is that a good student is a compliant one. It's one who goes along with the rules, who does the work that's expected of them, and doesn't cause a good deal of disruption. And certainly, work in Ireland and elsewhere has shown that boys are more likely to be reprimanded by teachers. We've talked about the ladishness, but also to receive more severe sanctions like detention or temporary exclusion, even taking account of their level of misbehaviour. So there's some evidence that boys are disproportionately punished, or perhaps more visible in their misbehaviour to be punished, and that actually sets up a more negative cycle of disengagement. So for this group of boys, and they're especially working class boys, you get a cycle of them acting up in class, being reprimanded, but that reprimand being responded to by further misbehaviour rather than by correcting the issue of misbehaviour. And part of the issue of compliance, if you like, and conscientiousness is that we really see a big difference between girls and boys in the time they invest in homework and study. And that gap actually grows over the course of secondary education. So when it comes to the high stakes exams, which often reward a lot of certainly in Ireland, rote learning and a lot of repetition and coverage of course material, that it's not surprising then that feeds in to better grades. Now, there's another aspect of schooling that I haven't talked about yet, and that's about school gender mix. There's been a really long-running debate since at least the 60s, research-based debate. There's a longer-running debate than that in policy terms, on whether single-sex and co-educational schools are better or worse for boys as opposed to girls. It's actually, in some systems, really hard to assess this. In some systems, single-sex schools are highly selective. So it's really difficult to separate out the fact that that's a fee-paying school, it's an independent school, from the fact that it's single-sex. In those kinds of countries, the findings are generally that those in single-sex schools are doing better. But as I say, it's really hard to separate that out from the highly elite nature of that group socially. There are some countries like Ireland and Australia and New Zealand actually that have larger single-sex sectors, so it makes it easier to compare like with like. Australian findings are quite variable. There's studies that have shown that girls are doing better in single-sex. There are studies that have shown that boys are doing better in single-sex. In Ireland, we've done a good deal of work about this, and we find when you actually take account of the kinds of students going to single-sex schools that you're not seeing any difference for either girls or boys. But yet it's got a lot of policy traction lately. There's been a number of initiatives in the US, some states, and Australia, some states, to introduce single-sex classes as a way of promoting gender equity. Sometimes to get girls to take STEM subjects, but more often to say that they will try and boost boys' achievement by having them taught in male-only classes. And that the findings for those interventions tend to show that it's often the interventions that make the difference. So putting more effort into this, putting more time into things like reading, rather than the gender mix per se. Teacher gender is often pointed to as an explanation for this phenomenon. People point to the feminisation of the teaching profession across developed countries. And some people have said, well, this is really explaining the gender difference in attainment. Boys don't have male role models in schools, therefore they're not seeing education as for them. But there have been very few studies that have actually looked at whether that's in fact the case. And those few studies that have looked at whether teacher gender makes a difference, above and beyond other teacher factors like qualifications and experience and so on, have generally found no significant difference between students taught by male or female teachers when you compare like with like. Now, there's a final set of explanations, a final potential explanation that I think has great merit as well. And it's got a lot more attention as the phenomenon has grown, as the structured nature of children's lives outside school is better documented. This goes back to a notion developed by Annette Lareau in the States of concerted cultivation. So she argued that middle-class parents really try to invest and promote the education and development of their children. They do that through choice of school and through supporting school activities, but they also do it through sending children to enrichment activities outside school, like music, like dance, like drama. And when people have tried to measure this participation outside school, what they do find it is middle-class parents, but they also find really strong gender differences. And I'm going to show you some examples from Irish research, but they're really very similar to other findings. And why this matters in particular, is that taking part in these structured activities and reading for pleasure outside school actually contribute to within-school learning. So they help to boost cognitive skills, they help to enhance attitudes to school, and they reduce socio-emotional difficulties like being hyperactivity or lacking concentration in class. So there's a really strong argument that the differential involvement of girls in these activities is contributing to that gender gap in achievement. So I'll just show you this. This is from a child cohort study that we run called Growing Up in Ireland, which is very similar to Growing Up in Scotland. In fact, we stole, with permission, some of your questions. So it shows social groups: professional, managerial, non-manual, semi and non-skilled, that would be the traditional working class, and that group of households that hadn't the labour market history to allow them to be assigned a class, so they had a long record of unemployment, and we see boys and girls. So you can see that for all the social groups, there's a marked gender difference in the proportion who are reading every day at the age of 9, and this continues to older age. But what is really worth noting is that we see that the working class girls, the girls from the much more disadvantaged groups, have actually a higher rate of reading than the middle class boys. So you have a very complex interaction there between gender and social background. When we come to the structured cultural activities, so this is music, dance, drama, classes or clubs, it's quite broad. First of all, you can see that this is really dominant now among 9-year-olds. Like, they're leading such a structured life outside school, but there's a massive gender gap. And again, we're seeing the disadvantaged girls are actually more involved than the middle class boys. And these are the two sets of out-of-school activities that have positive payoff for within-school learning, and for all sorts of other outcomes. I mean, I'm not arguing for arts and culture in instrumental terms, but it's worth noting as a contributor to the gender gap. Now, before I talk briefly about policy and practice, I just want to nuance that a little bit, and I want to say, well, is it all girls and all boys? Are they just simple binary opposites? But actually, as you've seen from the charts, gender interacts in very complex ways with social class background and with the social class mix of the school. So Diane Ray has argued that binaries such as male-female, boy-girl often prevent us from seeing the full range of diversity and differentiation existing within one gender, as well as between categories of male and female. So research has clearly pointed out to the fact that it's really certain groups of boys that perform poorly rather than all boys. So we need to get a bit beyond this male-female binary. And some have argued that really it's a bit misdirected to be putting all the policy attention on failing boys, because the scale of gender differences in outcomes is much less than differences in terms of social background or ethnicity. And there are differing findings on whether the gender gap is bigger for some classes or for some ethnic groups. But there's growing evidence that it is working class boys in particular that are the ones that are falling behind, and that working class girls are not experiencing as poor outcomes. Now I'm going to and behaviours. I'm going to show you, this shows, this was a longitudinal study I did in Ireland, and it follows students from the beginning of secondary school, but here I've taken them from second year up to the end of upper secondary education. So every year students were asked whether schoolwork was more difficult, more challenging than the year before, and whether they invested more time in homework and study in response to that. So you can see that the investment, obviously, as you would expect, peaks in the exam years here and here, not surprising. But what we see is that there's the lowest level of kind of acceleration of investment is among working class boys. They do respond to the exams, but not hugely. There's not a huge response here to kind of being faced with a kind of terminal examination. But when we look at the working class girls, the purple, we see that their behaviours more or less overlap with the middle class boys, except a little bit towards the end of upper secondary education when they separate out. But there's a gulf there in terms of behaviour, though it narrows here, all the way through lower secondary and the beginning of upper secondary in terms of girls' investment. And we had girls in that study. There were, in fact, one group of middle class girls went to their school and they had supervised study in the school. That was being offered for 3 hours in the evening, and they went and campaigned to the head teacher to have that extended to 4 hours because it wasn't enough. And you know, very high levels of associated stress. So I want to kind of conclude by saying a few things about policy and practice, because I think that's probably what most people are interested in. Now, there have been a number of initiatives internationally, and especially Australia, you know, to respond to this boy crisis. And, you know, they've done things like develop what they call boy-friendly pedagogies, you know, different ways of teaching and learning to cater to boys. A lot of discussion of, well, should we give boys comics to read rather than novels because that'll engage them. There's been no evidence that these interventions have really worked. And there's a real risk of saying, you know, we're into a zero-sum trade-off. We have to change things to suit boys, but what happens to girls? But there are actually, you know, a number of other researchers, and I would count myself among them, to say that improving teaching and learning and school climate will have positive effects for both boys and girls. And given that we see the poorest outcomes for working class boys, we have to see gender equity and social equity as interrelated. So we have to, any policy interventions to try and help the most disadvantaged, we also have to look at the way that is often the most disadvantaged boys. So what kinds of things would that look like? What kinds of things would make a difference? So certainly our research, and a good deal of research, has pointed to these things as enhancing all student outcomes, but particularly boys in some of the cases. So a variety of teaching methods with active involvement from students. We've had, in Ireland at least, a very teacher-centred form of classroom setup, largely reflecting the focus on high-stakes examinations. And that does lead to a lot of disengagement among students you know, who weren't very engaged in school in the first place. Less rigid forms of ability grouping, because a number of studies would show where there is very rigid ability grouping, it tends to be boys who are allocated to the lower stream classes, and so therefore they will fall even further behind. We need to look at kind of high teacher expectations, high and realistic teacher expectations. Positive school climate will have a payoff for all students, but particularly for boys, because they are the ones who are being exposed to the more punitive forms of discipline. And I think that really has to, you know, move away from we have to move towards a more positive way of framing behaviour, because certainly it was one of the working class schools in that longitudinal study I looked at, and by halfway through third year of lower secondary education, 40% of the students have been temporarily excluded at some point in the school year to date. So that obviously wasn't affecting their behaviour. And when you spoke to them, they were regarded as time off school. So there has to be a better way, rather than getting into the cycle of teachers reprimanding students and students acting out. But we can't forget the fact that we're seeing still very gender stereotyped take-up of some subjects. So we need to look at an approach to subject choice which recognises the risks of gender stereotyping. Now, I'm not sure we've cracked the issue of how to really reduce that, but I think there are definitely things schools can do not to make it worse. And finally, I think we need to pay more policy attention to the provision of out-of-school learning opportunities, especially for more disadvantaged groups of boys. A, to find activities that will involve them, but B, to get over the economic barrier that is there for many of these activities are paid for or require payment of some kind. So just to conclude, as I've said, there's been a significant shift in the gender gap in educational attainment in Western countries, but gender differences persist in field of study, and they persist in the labour market, because despite this discourse of girls are doing fine, labour market outcomes are far from as positive as that. But there's a real risk that in talking about this issue, we don't ask which girls and which boys are experiencing educational difficulties, that we don't nuance our understanding sufficiently. And we've not always been very good at explaining change. I've pointed to some of the things that I think might partially explain the changes we've seen, but I think often we kind of fall into the trap of using post hoc explanations of what's going on. And I think Christine Skelton put it very well when she said, gendered classroom expectations and performances of girls have been translated from failure to victory without any actual change in behaviours. So I think this is a debate that needs to be continued, and we need a lot more work in this space. So thank you.
Hello, I'm Jenny Stewart. Two roles here. I'm a partner at KPMG in my day job, but I'm also a trustee of the David Hume Institute. And when this subject was suggested as one for study, I was incredibly enthused about doing that. It's such an important area as part of wider research, I think, in terms of boys and mental health and all sorts of other areas. So we're going to move on to a question and answer session, and as usual we have drinks outside at 7:30. So that's going to be a cut-off at the end of the period. For asking questions, I think if you can put your hand up, say where you're from, and raise your question. Just while you're thinking of your questions, I won't hog the floor and ask questions, but if I can just say to Emer, that was absolutely fascinating presentation and raised so many interesting issues. I must say, as a mother of two teenage boys, when you talked about boys are more likely to be reprimanded given their level of misbehaviour, I could hear my sons and my nephews both saying, we've been telling you that for the last X number of years. So no doubt we'll pick up some of that in debate. So questions and answers. Oh, we've got plenty. Great. So what we'll do, Emer, if you would like, we'll take a few and then pick up some. So I saw a hand at the very back there and a hand here. If we take those first two, and then we'll come to the two gentlemen later on. Thank you.
I'm Cathy Howson from Edinburgh University. Thank you, Emer. That was just a brilliant tour around such a complex subject. I'm totally impressed by it. There's so many points I could pick up on, but one I just wanted to raise in the context of Scotland. What you were saying about the effect of how schools, which subject schools choose to offer, and the fact that they try to offer them in relation to the perceived needs and requirements of their pupils, and then how they package them, really caused alarm bells to ring for me in the context of Curriculum for Excellence in Scotland. because the whole basis of Curriculum for Excellence is about providing greater diversity, giving local authorities, schools and teachers greater leeway to offer provision that is better meets the needs of their particular students. Now, there's some current research by Reform Scotland showing that this is actually probably being detrimental to youngsters from working class backgrounds, basically. But now you're making me think of a gender issue as well. There's lots of other points, but I won't hog the floor either.
The question down here, the lady in the... There's a microphone just coming to you.
Margaret McIntosh, former head teacher and formerly very active in trying to raise girls' attainment and expectations of themselves in the 80s. Could you explain to me that last point? I don't quite understand it. Gender classroom expectations and performance of girls have been translated from failure to victory without any actual change in behaviours. I don't follow that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Do you want to take those two?
Yeah, just on the last point first, because Kathy's is probably more complicated. It's really the idea that in the 70s and 80s we tried to explain why girls were failing or losing out. And now we're talking about why boys are losing out. But a lot of the behaviours, the day-to-day interaction in class, was very, very similar. So we're using the same sets of explanations to explain very different outcomes, if that makes sense, does it? And Kathy's point, yeah, actually, that's a really interesting point about Curriculum for Excellence. We actually have a lower secondary reform that's kind of semi in limbo at the moment, but one of the and part of it draws on our research in moving away from terminal exams, but the other part doesn't, which is allowing schools to put together a curriculum that better matches the needs of their students. And I've had this discussion, and I think you're right. I think it is going to lead to more social class differences in subject take-up and access, and to different gendered patterns. And it's a difficult one, because I know for principals, for head teachers, they're trying to match the needs of their students. And you don't want to be imposing, I don't know, ancient Greek on a group of students who have no interest. But at the same time, if students, especially at lower secondary level, do not have exposure to certain valuable areas of knowledge, they won't be able to access them subsequently. So they will be excluded from upper secondary subjects and therefore higher education and further education areas. And I think that is the risk, because more choice sounds great, but it actually leads to more inequalities.
There were two questions from two gentlemen on this side.
Hi, my name is Mike Ash, and I have a background as a teacher, a head teacher, and an inspector of schools in 3 areas in England. And my observation, although I wouldn't think it was statistically valid, was that schools who had made progress, particularly during the 90s, in lowering the difference between the attainment of boys and girls, didn't necessarily raise the average attainment over the whole school. And in many cases, the schools that were achieving the greatest, I'm talking about with value added, not just from advantaged communities, often had some of the greatest disparities. The other factor which was particularly interesting was the factor that involved community groups, particularly racial community groups. So, for instance, where there was a Chinese population, how outstanding performance difference between the non-Chinese. And it's made me wonder over the years whether there are a whole series of factors to do with nurture which are perhaps more dominant than some of the nature ones that you describe in terms of behaviour. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
That's the first question. And this, sorry.
First of all, many thanks for a very cogent presentation. One factor you don't bring into your argument, though, is the verbal skills factor. Now, I think it's established that girls learn to speak from an earlier age, and they continually use their verbal skills right up into adulthood, in fact. And might not this be a partial contributory to the fact that you've already pointed out that boys prefer to tick a box in the multiple choice, whereas girls prefer something open-ended, something where, in fact, they can use these verbal skills.
Thank you.
Well, on the first point, I think that's an interesting point, and I don't think I've seen anyone put it forward before. Though a number of people would make the point that a lot of the focus has been on the relative difference between boys and girls, and not the fact that standards have been raised, or at least measured performance levels have been raised more correctly. I think you make an interesting point about Chinese students, and when you actually look at a really broken out performance by lots of different background factors like ethnic background, social class and gender, you find that the gender gap is very different across those different groups. So we haven't got a handle on why that should be. And I think nurture is a key, obviously, but how that plays out and the mechanisms for that nurture, we can identify some, but not all. I think that's an important point about verbal skills, and certainly education systems, Western education systems, are very strongly predicated on having strong literacy base. Even practical subjects in Ireland, there are theoretical sections. It is very difficult to do well if you don't have those strong verbal skills. Now, the issue is then the origin of those verbal skills, whether we go back to neuroscience and say it's different, or whether it is about socialization and reward, and reinforcement and that. And, that's one of the big questions. But certainly in other work we've done, we've shown that the kinds of activities that even toddlers do differs between girls and boys. So girls are slightly more likely to be read to even at the age of 3. Even things like painting and drawing, girls are painting and drawing more often at the age of 3. And I mean, for me, there's no natural gender stereotype for that. I mean, it's not like the world of art is lacking of male role models. So I think, I'm not sure that the verbal skills are innate, because when we actually look at gender gaps in reading, they're quite different across countries. But I do think it is around socialisation and around nurture and about the home learning environment. And I don't know if it's that boys are seen as more troubled and troubling, and that's becoming more so. I mean, I did some work where I was only looking at gender in passing, but we're even seeing kind of higher levels of parental stress in the parents of male infants of 9 months old than female infants. So I wish I had a straightforward answer, but I think it's also that those verbal skills are reinforcing. So it's kind of Matthew effect, that you will gain more if you have those skills at school entry, because everything else is built on that foundation. Thank you.
There was another question from the chap in the middle with the black shirt. Thank you. Yeah, and one again at the back. And then
Hi, John Naylor. Various organisations outside school, like the YMCA and Youth Arts, Performing Arts. Going forward, education is going to be strapped for cash, and the subjects in which boys succeed tend to be the more expensive ones. In longer term policy, how do you see that affecting the gender mix?
And there was a question right at the back. Chap right at the back, I think. Yeah.
Name's James Aitken, thank you. What does the gender gap picture look like between those countries where the formal school starting age is higher than those countries where than other countries? So, for example, in Finland, where it's 7, compared to England, where it's 4, and where in those countries where there's standardized testing from an early age at 5, for example, compared to those that have a kindergarten for those extra 3 years. Thank you.
So, yep, sorry. Okay. Yes, the issue of education expenditure and cutbacks. I'm from a country where we've had our cuts already, where the recession from 2008 led to quite devastating educational cuts. We didn't see a shift in the gender pattern. We did see a shift in the pattern for more disadvantaged groups, where the kind of supports that were in place to enable them to engage with school. So things like broader psychological supports, counselling supports and so on were stripped away. Out of school activities were stripped away. Holiday-based activities were stripped away. Yeah, the idea of boys' subjects being more expensive, I haven't come across that so much, and maybe that's a reflection on there not being a huge amount of investment in kind of technological subjects in the Irish context, that they wouldn't be very resource intensive. But it's certainly something that needs to be watched. On the school starting age, there's no evidence that there's a simple relationship with the gender differences in educational outcomes at all. So the idea, and I have seen it offered, that, you know, if we wait for boys to catch up in the verbal skills, that, you know, by 6 things will be fine. But that's not playing out. We find more that cross-national variation in the gender gap and in achievement, but also in take-up of STEM subjects among girls, is more to do with broader social and gender equality in the broader society, and having, you know, female role models out there. Thanks.
Now, there was a question, did I see one down here earlier on? Right, okay. So there's a chap who's been waiting patiently again on that side, and then I'm going to come over to this side, the lady in the blue.
Melvin Roth from George Watson's College. In a way, this is a question which picks up the experience of gentlemen behind with regard to Chinese ethnic students. And that is to ask whether you've referenced a number of Western countries. Is there a similar gender gap in, for example, the Chinese systems where there are comparable data through PISA and other tests?
And the lady in the blue there. Yep.
Julia Wilson, music teacher, North Berwick High School. What you were saying about the working class boys, looking particularly at them, had a resonance with me, and I just wondered what your thoughts were on one of your implications. You mentioned less rigid forms of ability grouping. I wondered what your thoughts were in terms of working class boys and how they could learn better either in mixed ability or in same-sex groups, or just how to, the kind of learning groups that these particular kinds of learners that they best thrive in. Thank you.
Okay, so on the China, to my shame, and I would note that PISA doesn't cover all of China, it covers Shanghai and some other areas. I think there is a gender gap in reading in favour of girls, but I don't know how it compares with Western countries. But I would note that, you know, PISA is some of the story, but I actually think that when we've been able to compare PISA type scores with more high stakes or qualification performance, that we see a bigger gender gap. So in standardised tests that are low stakes, I don't think they pick up as much of the gender gap as where you have a terminal exam, that you've got differential investment in homework and study on the part of girls and so on, and kind of coursework and so on. But I will look up the Chinese figures tonight, I promise. On the issue of what kind of grouping, I mean, certainly our research would be consistent with other people's research, which showed that when you had kind of concentration of the lower ability or lower assessed ability group that were disproportionately boys in one class, that it just really led to disengagement and disaffection. The justification for this from the schools was that they could match the pace of instruction to the learning of those students, but in fact we found that a significant proportion, about 4 in 10, were finding the pace too slow for them. So that really didn't work. And I'm not saying that mixed ability teaching isn't challenging, it is. But there's some really good examples out there of using peer learning. I don't know if you know Jo Bowler's work on maths. She's done some really nice work in quite disadvantaged circumstances of using peer learning in maths, where, you know, I mean, that's the 11th commandment, thou shalt not teach mixed ability maths. So of using that peer learning and actually not just narrowing the gap by prior achievement, but actually boosting the score of those who come in with initially higher level achievement, because they're developing a more deeper conceptual understanding by having to explain it to their peers. And it isn't without challenge, but I certainly would think, it's quite clear the evidence is that streaming doesn't work. And it can be a way of kind of trying to do crowd control by putting the more disruptive students in another class. But certainly in terms of their educational outcomes, the outcomes are terrible.
Interesting. We had a couple more questions on this side of the house. The lady in the grey jacket, and then the gentleman at the front here.
Again, I would say, thank you for the presentation this evening. It's been, highly valued, certainly by me. My name's Val Corey. I was a former head teacher of a secondary school here in Scotland, a high-attaining school with a significant gap in gendered attainment. And I was particularly interested when you spoke about the which boys and which girls, and I've now gone on to the University of Glasgow and just finished a piece of research on this. And what I found was that when you look at the pattern of attainment across the different ability ranges within the school that I led, that where there was a significant gap in attainment, statistically significant, it was amongst the able boys and the able girls. And I did a piece of research seeking from the boys and the girls themselves what the perceptions were of their learning to try and find an explanation. And I did what you suggested, which was improve the teaching and learning climate of the school significantly over the space of 10 years, and the gap remained. The attainment went up through the roof, but the gap remained. And I then went on to University of Glasgow to do some research, and what came out of it for me was it wasn't about peer pressure, and it wasn't about ladishness, because these boys didn't have poor behaviour. And we offered a wide range of choice, so there wasn't a case if there was a narrowing of the choice. But what came out of it was that the boys themselves understood their own learning, and these were able boys, middle-class able boys, but they had a gendered response, that their attainment was being limited by their gendered view of themselves. And also the way girls, they also had a gendered view, and to try and sort of triangulate this, I also spoke to teachers and parents, and they also had a similar view. So I then went on to another school with the same pattern and the same rurality, which was, I had on a rural school, and I found the same result, that where there was a gendered pattern, the response from the boys was very much they understood about what helped them in their learning, but they had this gender stereotypical response. But the fascinating piece of the research was I found another school where the boys were doing better than the girls. And when I interviewed them and their teachers, there was no mention of gender or gendered stereotyping. So out of it for me wasn't the assessment or the ladishness, the behaviour, the peer pressure, was this sense, as you said in the beginning, about the socialisation, that feeling that, I'm a boy or I'm a girl, and this is what the expectation of how I should behave. So quite an interesting study. So I was just interested to know if you had done any specific work on academically able boys and girls to see if you found any difference.
I'm just going to pick up another question first before we take to that, and then I'll come to you shortly. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Darryl Mead. I work for the Reward Foundation, a Scottish educational charity. And I'd like to ask a slightly left field question. I researched the use of internet pornography by adolescents, including by gender. And it's a new environmental factor that wasn't there even 10 years ago. That seems to have potential to affect gender performance and the gaps there. Do you have any awareness of relevant educational research that might reflect on today's discussion, please?
I think your point, your research sounds fascinating. I'd love to hear more. I'm not aware that I was finding those patterns. In fact, overall, all of the kind of school-based work we've shown has been showing much greater between school variation at the lower end, so that schools make more of a difference to the lower ability students. But that doesn't explain the gender gap. No, certainly my recall is that you weren't getting that, but you're seeing quite specific school climates. And also that could be a cumulative effect, that if you have a legacy, which is now a longer legacy of girls doing better, quote unquote, then that becomes the new frame of reference. So, yeah, that's very interesting.
Happy to share.
Yeah, no, I'd really be fascinating. The internet porn issue, it's a good point. And we actually did want to ask about internet porn usage in the Growing Up in Ireland study, but the ethics committee wouldn't let us. Oh, no, sorry. I don't mean that in a facetious way. I mean, long story short, in response to kind of some of the institutional abuse scandals, child protection regulation now is very stringent in Ireland. So everybody's absolutely terrified about asking something because then they will have to disclose. So if an underage person is, But yes, and I think that's a big gap on what we know. And I think it probably fits into the broader span of out-of-school activities, like boys spending more time on screen time and computer games. Though in fact, the work that I referenced here showed that for television watching, you were getting a bit of a boost in cognitive skills because of the verbal skills, but it was associated with greater hyperactivity, loss of concentration. But we weren't seeing a net effect of the computer game space at that. But I can't comment more specifically on the internet porn. But certainly, I mean, I cannot but see it as increasingly framing young people's views of gender and sexuality and, what it is to be a boy and a girl in contemporary society.
Also that time they're using.
Yeah.
So, question in the middle there.
Ronald Watt. Until the last moment, I was surprised that you had given all this emphasis to differences in reading skills, which I accept, and from early ages, but not a word about differences in IT skills and the gender differences there. Is that not going to have greater significance in the economic sense in our developing economies? And it may be that employers give greater weighting to what I would think would be greater IT skills overall amongst boys rather than girls. And maybe part of the explanation of the next big problem you've got of the crossover between the girls' greater ability at school and yet employers being willing to pay males more.
We don't have a second question, so could I ask you one? And I'd be interested to know, looking at the graph you had at the end around the differences between middle class and working class kids, and your point there about new frame of reference, is it that now people are so conscious of the previous underachievement of girls that actually middle class girls from families, they're so conscious of that previously that there's more of a push, more recognition that they're doing more, and therefore that it's that new frame of reference that is pushing them to do better. So there were two questions.
Yeah, it's an interesting question about the IT skills, because on the one hand we're seeing that boys are spending more time on computer games and so on, but in many tests of the use of IT skills, the use of IT for other things that are learning related, we're not seeing a very significant gender gap. We're seeing variation across different kinds of IT skills. We're definitely seeing more formal take-up of IT courses by young men than young women. But I'm not sure that the IT gap there is a very simple way. And in fact, I mean, this is anecdotal, but I'll tell it anyway. With this child cohort study that I mentioned, the infant cohort is coming up to the age of 9, which mirrors the earlier cohort. And there was a discussion about, things are moving on, even though we're really old and really Luddite, we should be using more up-to-date methods of capturing these things. And, whereas before we got the 9-year-olds to do self-complete paper and pencil questionnaires, now we should have tablets. So we kind of said, well, we need to trial this. you know, and see what's working. And while this group of children who are very familiar with IT and were using, you know, IT-based entertainment at home and on a day-to-day basis, when it came to using it in a particular way with which they were unfamiliar, those skills weren't necessarily transferable. So they actually struggled with doing a kind of a questionnaire on a tablet. So I think we have to be careful about what kind of IT skills are being developed and how they're transferable and what kind of exposure kids are getting in school. On your last point about the frame of reference, yeah, I mean, I think the frame of reference is changing all the time, because I think, you know, you've seen education, higher education expansion in Scotland. We've seen massive expansion in Ireland. So I think the frame of what it takes to finish your education is changing all the time. And that's happening it's in interaction with gender and social background and expectations. But certainly, I mean, looking at the kind of work we've done with the students and following them and interviewing groups of girls and groups of boys and mixed groups, the push from students themselves to do well and from some girls to do well, it's not that it's really coming from their parents, because people keep saying, oh, it's coming from their parents and teachers, but they know there are high stakes attached to that exam. They know it will matter whether they access higher education, whether they get into the course they want in the institution they want, and also employers pay attention to final exam grades. So in that context, they are becoming the driver of that. So also that kind of perpetuates itself, if you like, of that kind of feeling of pressure.
That seems to reflect what's happening in London within ethnic minorities, that there's huge change in attainment there that's making a big difference. Good, we've got some more questions right at the back there again. And the lady there, thank you.
Hi, Cathy Hanson. I just wanted to pick up on the point that was raised about the gender pay gap post-university. 2 reasons. One is just highlighting the fact that, yes, we're talking about the success, inverted commas, of girls, but in fact, it doesn't pay off in the same way later on. But what I found very interesting when Linda, in particular, it was Linda who produced a lot of the data rather than me, when you look at the differences across occupation and industry in terms of the gender pay gap, that although young female graduates earn less than male graduates in the same subject area, which is the surprise for me, but there's not necessarily a gender pay gap in some industries. And I seem to remember something like mining and extractive industries, which is, they actually had a positive pay improvement for young women than young men. So it's not across the board, and I think it would be fascinating to try and investigate across different industries as to what's going on, what's driving the gender pay gap.
And there was a question, the lady halfway down there.
I'm Angela Gardner. I published the Learning and Skills Digest Informed Scotland. Just interestingly, last week, British Council Scotland held an event to launch a research publication, Leadership and Empowerment, on gender equality and empowerment of women and girls in the UK. And it's interesting that obviously on the one hand they were talking about the similar problems, the similar gap, the gender gap that you've been describing, and in achievement. And we also heard recently from UCAS about the growing gender gap in applicants to university, and that they've even indicated that if it continues in the same way, that the gender gap could outweigh the gap in advantage and disadvantage. But on the other hand, the British Council event was looking at the leaders, the lack of female leaders and role models. So you highlighted the feminisation of education, but there is still a difference in the people at the top, and that is the same in, you have medicine and law. You still have females who are predominantly coming out of universities, going into law practices, but they're not the people who are in charge on the whole. And I wanted to know whether you think that this is there a lag? Is there a time lag? Is this something that we will see? So the gender gap that you are describing, will it eventually mean that there will be a catch-up in post-school, post-education, in role models, or is it a completely different issue that needs to be addressed in a different way?
I take the 2 points together because I think they're very interrelated. And I didn't get time to address it in the presentation, but we are talking about all this change, but we are also talking about quite stark differences still in field of study. But we are also talking about quite stark differences in terms of occupational and industrial segregation in the labour market. I mean, it's not a simple story of, economists use the term pay discrimination, but these economic situations arise from the interaction of employer expectations and then the kinds of skills and qualifications people bring to the labour market. So that gender, there's a large literature on this. Gender becomes built into certain jobs. That can be disrupted. But a lot of the explanation for the gender gap among younger people, you get other factors coming in later on, but is around the kind of differential distribution across jobs and occupations and employers, like size of employers. So I think they're very complex processes going on there. Is it a case of a time lag? I think time does something, but like I've been around long enough to remember all those discussions that, this will eventually catch up, and if we watch it, and it hasn't happened. I'm not saying there hasn't been an improvement in female representation in things like the civil service and so on. But, if you look at educational leadership, men are disproportionately school principals relative to their representation in the labour force. So I think we can't just depend on an educational lever to bring about equality in the labour market, that we have to actually look at employment policies and practices, and we have to look at those issues around segregation. But it's a really difficult one to crack, because even countries, or especially countries that have more gender equality in day-to-day life in terms of attitudes, countries like Sweden have really marked levels of occupational segregation by gender, largely but not entirely driven by the concentration of women in public sector employment.
Bob, there was a question there.
Thanks. Bob Cormack. I spent 30 years in Northern Ireland researching many of these issues before being repatriated to the Highlands of Scotland, UHI. Thank you for that magisterial overview of the subject. I wonder if I can lead you into temptation, Emer, and if you might want to make some statements or conclusions on religious schools. Quite clearly, the Church of England schools in England are doing rather well, effectively, but certainly in Northern Ireland, the Catholic system was particularly effective for working class kids. And the most recent statistics would suggest that Catholic girls now outperform Protestant girls, and Protestant boys are right down at the bottom of the heap, very dangerously down at the bottom of the heap. I wonder if you have any thoughts on religious schools. Thank you.
Very small and minor question there, and this is a very live issue in Ireland, because at primary level, 94% of primary schools are religious run. It's a slightly smaller percentage at secondary level. It depends on what you count as religious. It's very like the single-sex debate, because often it's not comparing like with like, because you're talking about selection into religious schools. Now, that very much depends on the position of those religious schools in the country. So in some countries, religious schools, there's a big American literature. So Catholic schools have been shown to have really positive effects for student outcomes, not just academically, but socio-emotionally. But it's not a random allocation to Catholic schools. So it is very hard to partial out those kind of factors. When religious schools are more dominant in countries like Ireland, you don't see a difference around religion. It becomes other fault lines, which are about social mix in the school. The Northern Irish issue, I mean, I think that's a really good example, and that there's been a quite shift in those kind of relativities. But I think that is the broader changes in occupational structure, industrial structure, the political situation, and how that has been interpreted, those two things by Protestant working class boys, and the lack of that kind of secure craft industrial outlet for them. So in a way that's a non-answer, but I think the boost is largely associated with selection. But I mean, I could stand to be corrected. But there are other outcomes, and I'd be the first to say that, you know, in Irish secondary schools, there are really good examples of a strong pastoral care and socio-emotional support tradition that came directly from the involvement of the religious orders, and still would kind of be putting some resources into schools.
That seemed like a good one to end on, and I'm conscious we're just about running out of time. So I'm going to ask Ray to come up and conclude, and then we'll move on to drinks. So thank you all for such fascinating questions.
Can we thank Emer Smyth for her really interesting presentation. It's a subject we would like to return to in the future, because I think there are a lot of implications there which we need to explore. And I'm very grateful to her for coming to that, and to Jenny Stewart for chairing the question and answer, and to you for your attention and for very interesting discussion points and questions. Our next seminar is on May the 11th. I'm afraid we return to not politics particularly, but economics, particularly how Scotland is using its new economic powers and the implications of those for the Scottish Government budget. It's not here. It is at Audit Scotland offices, but details on the website. But for now, can I ask you to thank Emer Smyth in the usual way, and then invite you to take a drink with us and continue the discussion in the foyer. Thank you.